I think most would agree that enemy design is one of the most important elements of any game. A good, well-crafted bestiary can really bring out the best out of a game, while a poor one will make the game feel kind of dull. This fact hits even harder in the roguelike genre, where half the game is about fighting the same enemies over and over and over again. Therefore, your enemies should be very carefully designed. Well, one of the biggest challenges I had in Project Bloom was coming up with interesting and fun enemy designs. I've spent over a year really trying to figure out what I was doing wrong. The enemies just didn't feel that fun to fight. The enemies that fought in groups didn't feel as bad, since you could pair a support enemy with an offensive enemy and the AI could come up with something. But solo enemies like elite and boss monsters had a really significant flaw. That is, how do you solve the situation where multiple player units are beating on a single enemy unit? You could play around with enemy stats, but if the stats are too low, the enemy just dies before it does anything, and if it's too high, it'll just survive the onslaught and then kill somebody in the process. It causes the fights to feel very volatile. So it's not necessarily a stat problem, it's a design problem. We need better ideas, and we need to properly understand enemy design. My initial reaction, like always, was to go study other games. I looked at my usual list of turn-based RPGs and I got really interesting insights. But the issue I was running into is that different games have different approaches at handling enemies. I personally couldn't find any real solid ground or overarching design philosophies. But through some miracle, one day I was explaining the solo monster problem to the chat and a good viewer recommended a video by Matt Colville titled Action-Oriented Design. Matt's video starts out by laying out my exact problem. How do you solve the situation when you have multiple player units beating down on a single enemy? Well, Matt recommends, before stats or anything, put a focus on enemy actions. Specifically, their actions, bonus actions, and reactions. He goes into great lengths in his video using D&D as an example, but basically actions are just the base actions an enemy can do, their core set of attacks and spells. Bonus actions are actions that the enemy does outside of their main turn, like before and after their turn or even during the player's turn. And finally, reactions are the actions that the enemy does in reaction to the player or the other enemy actions. I know, a little wordy. But basically, think like a boss that counters magical attacks or a boss that gains a buff when a player dies, something that happens in reaction to the player. These additional actions allow the solo enemy to actually fight back. Sure, you'll still be able to CC them, but when they get an action, they'll do something meaningful and it'll be more than just one thing. It's through this action-oriented design philosophy that I was able to really improve the elite enemy designs in Project Bloom. I went and reworked a bunch of enemy designs on paper, and I just wanted to share the one that I worked on recently. The Eldritch Abomination was one of my first elite enemies, and it was supposed to be this heavy-hitting magical attacker with some support skills. His attacks were Tentacle Strike, a normal attack, Abyssal Blast, a heavy-hitting tank buster, Cursed Aura, a heavy AoE attack, and Void Shield, a skill that granted 2 shield stacks. Functionally, this works, but it fell into the same problems mentioned before. The enemy mostly sat around getting beat on, so I redesigned it. I started by removing the Void Shield since it didn't really fit the monster's theme that well. It does get to keep its other 3 commands though, but gains an additional bonus action called Crystal Jail. Crystal Jail is an action that is performed after any of the Abomination's regular actions. The skill captures a player unit and traps them inside of a crystal. For every turn the player is trapped, the Abomination will heal a percentage of its health as a secondary bonus action. If the player fails to break the crystal in time, the unit will take massive damage from the explosion. Having that extra target on the field also doubles as a distraction from the main target, killing the meatball. If you rush to break the unit free, the meatball will get free chances to attack. But if you ignore the crystal, the unit inside will take heavy damage and potentially die. I also allowed for some counterplay to this mechanic by allowing the trapped allies to be targeted by heals, shields, and buffs. This gives an alternative defensive response for dealing with the crystal. As for the monster's reaction, when the crystal is destroyed, the Abomination is stunned, allowing players to recover. With these changes, the meatball immediately felt so much more engaging. Also, as a fun side note, it was supposed to be a tentacle that captured the player, but I couldn't figure out how to make that work as a sprite. So instead I just went with the crystal. It actually took like 3 hours to figure out how to make this look decent. It's basically a transparent front layer, a darkened back layer, and then the player just gets sandwiched between them. So by using action-oriented design, I feel like I'm becoming a little bit better at enemy design. However, this whole exercise reminded me of something that I've always known but always have to remind myself of. And it's that strong enemies really do need to have unique and different designs from your normal enemies. As a designer, that's probably pretty intuitive. It's fun to come up with crazy ideas for your game. But as a programmer, it's really easy to just shut ideas down because you know how hard it is to implement some of these features, especially when you're layering it on already existing spaghetti code. So a lot of my philosophy when implementing strong enemies was, how could I utilize the already existing systems to make interesting enemies? And that works to an extent, but unfortunately strong solo enemies just don't work that way. You really just kinda gotta let the designers cook, and as a programmer, bite the bullet and make those system changes. You have to come to the realization that yeah, you're going to make a one-off feature that is used on one boss one time, but it's important to the design and you have to do it. It's what's going to make your design shine. Bosses should have something unique and interesting, or else they just feel like a stat boosted enemy. With that said, I really hope you enjoyed today's video. If you'd like some more content, you could check out how I make particle effect systems in this video here. Or if you'd like more general game dev conversations, you could check out the video here. Additionally, you can wishlist Project Bloom on Steam. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.